earlier than Mr. Wiley's talk, and he put me at the end of the night, so if you fall asleep, you can go back there for refunds. All right. The title I chose for the talk is Vocation as a Catalyst of Culture. So in a general sense, I've been fascinated over the last few years with a concept that could be described as mechanisms of cultural transmission. The question to be addressed in this concept is, what are the elements of a culture that allow it, or perhaps prevent it, from surviving from one generation to the other? Somehow, elements of culture get from one generation to another through time and space, and we are curious about how that happens. Of course, being good proponents of natural law, we also believe that these built-in components of social life are also, in a significant sense, normative for us as well. That is to say, once we understand how culture is transmitted from one generation to another, we should spend some time to consider how we might amplify that process. We should find some way to make this practical as well. In line with the themes of the conference, I wanted to somehow relate the theory of cultural transmission into something that's actually useful. Where was I? And it's intriguing to talk about ideals, but it's also necessary to relate these to the here and now. The point here is not to offer career advice, but I do want to consider some actual takeaways that hopefully contribute to the general theme of this conference, namely in building and promoting generational wealth. And finally, I want to find some room here for some encouragement at the end. I think that anyone listening or watching this is acutely aware that the whimsical old vision of a meaningful vocation that satisfies the soul and the commonwealth is a near expired image, out of reach for most people who want it. We all sense this tragedy. The romantic ideal of a social order made up of kings and priests, soldiers and poets, peasant farmers, and specialized artisans, all that seems gone. It's all replaced by Uber drivers and content creators and paper pushers. So there's a sense, I think, of personal defeat and humiliation in many conversations about vocation, especially among younger men. I don't have all the answers, but I do hope at the end to offer a few remarks to those who find themselves in such a situation. So at last year's conference, during one of the workshop hours, we had a discussion built around the theme of education as a catalyst of culture. The objective was to advance the view of education that emphasized its role in passing on the cultural artifacts from one generation to another. Under this theory of education, influenced by people like Roger Scruton, the primary point of education was not the technical benefits that might accrue to the student, but the passing on from one generation to the next of a great repository of wisdom, stories, and artistic knowledge, including music and historical myth and literature. While personal development and the eventual well-roundedness of the student is absolutely an effect of a quality education, this is for Scruton secondary because there is a common good function that is preeminent. What I mean by common good should not be confused with the egalitarian social democracy framework that has been built up with the rise of the welfare state. In fact, as we will discuss later, this social democracy framework empties out the true meaning of vocation and rips away its function as a catalyst of culture, and instead obsesses over careerism and capacities of national consumption. Instead, our conservative view of education is in fact civilizational, transgenerational, and metaphysical in character. This view of education, this catalyst of cultural view, is at odds with the two great modernist views of education. The modernist views come primarily in two forms. One, which is heavily individualistic and emphasizes the priority of preparing students to have a successful career or a luxurious life. You can see this model of education come through especially when people question the relevance of things like Latin and classical literature, or perhaps the Bible and moral teaching. How do these archaic components of a European education help one become a millionaire? So much of the soul of classical education is at odds with the education framework that emphasizes individual material success and self-realization. The other modernist view is what I like to call the managerial view of education. It seeks to prepare the student to be a dependable cog in the great machine of our hyper-advanced economy. Under managerialism, there is an obsession with things like STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the arts and other necessary mechanisms that might carry culture toward future generations are downplayed or even eliminated altogether. After all, it is hard to see how a deep understanding of classical wisdom, which might, among other things, warn of the hubris of mankind, can lend any help toward the grand social goal of hitting new records in the stock market. Increasingly impressive handheld devices can reinforce the dominance of an American technological power on the world stage. And to be clear, these two theories of education are mutually reinforcing and serve the same end, namely the fortification of post-war American liberal democracy, which depends on men who are under the impression that they are free, capable of great success, but also the bureaucratization of the entire social order, which of course renders them profoundly unfree. In any case, the traditional view of education is that all this must be reconstructed. Education exists not only for the personal development of an individual, but as a vehicle through which our own culture can continue. Our art, our literature, our language, our history, our philosophical understanding, our religious life, our moral principles, our festivals, our shared memories, and our collective heroes and tragedies and triumphs can be kept alive from one generation to the next. The burden of transmitting these things belongs to the living, and they must carry it through sun and through rain if a culture is to continue to burn brightly and clearly within the soul of a people. The education process very much revolves around training the member of a culture to be a carrier for the rest of his or her life of some share of the cultural repository. He is being imbued with not just factual knowledge, but feeling and sentiment, cultural instinct, moral imagination that he can carry forward into the future and discharge out into the society at large. The healthy culture needs these living, breathing vehicles of cultural transmission because culture is never to be properly found in dusty old books, neither is it to be found in the objects of amusement that occupy the attention of a brainwashed mass society. Education is never siloed within the individual. It exists not chiefly for the student, but for his posterity. It is not only publicly oriented in the here and now, but it is oriented always toward the future. Culture is a means through which those dead and those yet to be born can meet each other in the dance of the living. So what does this theory of education have to do with vocation? I'm using the traditionalist understanding of culture as an analogy here to help you catch the vision. There is a parallel between education as a catalyst of culture and vocation as its own unique catalyst. Just as we've had to reconstruct the purpose of education, so we are able to reconstruct the cultural purpose of vocation. We will get to the meaning of vocation in a minute, but first let's look at what exactly we are trying to embody with the concept of culture. Culture is not something that can be just vanished away and remade on a whim. Though, of course, this is how the artifacts of entertainment in our present day are brought on and off the market. It is actually quite lamentable that when people hear the word culture today, the first thing they think of is some movie or a music album or some other consumer product with high demand. Culture has been commodified. It has been turned into a product, something manufactured, something that is strewn together to be purchased with our fake money and consumed. What we call culture is actually so often a stand-in or a replacement for culture. These things, I call them consumptive artifacts, are not really culture at all, but are placeholders. They function in the place of culture, and they exist because culture has been stolen from us, and we need some other thing to absorb our deep-seated desire for a common connection. Culture should never be confused with these consumptive artifacts. Culture itself is something deeper and something metaphysical. It is something corporate. I've noted elsewhere that one of the best understandings of true culture has been provided by the great historian of culture and Western social order, Christopher Dawson. Dawson describes culture in the following way. A social culture is an organized way of life, which is based on a common tradition and conditioned by a common environment. It is clear that a common way of life involves a common view of life, common standards of behavior, and common standards of value. And consequently, a culture is a spiritual community, which owes its unity to common beliefs and common ways of thought far more than to any unanimity of physical type. Culture manifests in the nexus, it's the end of the quote, culture manifests in the nexus and superstructure of stories, myths, legends, parables, paintings, music, landscapes, political symbology, ethnicities, hierarchies, religious sensibilities, liturgies, hygiene, and socially accepted mannerisms. Culture is the great complex of imagination that flows through the soul of a people. It does not depend on individuals, but the individuals very much depend on it. In my talk last year, I argued, using T.S. Eliot, that there's two senses of culture. One we labeled organic folkways, and the other high culture. The organic folkways are especially in view here. They are the habits and norms and customs and the mores, the instincts and routines of any given people. These habits and norms and ways of being generate from historical experience and a shared sense of identity, conditioned by a common environment, in the words of Dawson. From these things come the artistic derivatives or the cultural artifacts that I mentioned above. So then, how is culture transmitted over time? This is the key question. The answer is quite simple. Culture is transmitted by its catalysts. All cultures have catalysts that carry forth its unique characteristics across time and space. Education in school is, as we've already mentioned, a major catalyst of culture. Another catalyst would be all the cultural artifacts produced by a culture, but vocation as well should be thought of as a catalyst of culture. So what do we mean by vocation? When we think of vocation today, we often think more in terms of what is better described as a career or a job. As is true of our dilapidated understanding of education, so vocation has been so stripped of its deeper meaning and rendered within the framework of American managerialism and all its materialistic trappings. True vocation is much broader. It suggests some sort of divine sanction. When we look at a variety of historic writings on the concept of vocation, all of them can be found tend to talk about vocation in a broader social, anthropological, and theological sense. This is a fascinating indictment on the contemporary world. Vocation, in the traditional sense, treats wealth generation and generational wealth it treats wealth generation as a tertiary concern. In other words, vocation is not chiefly concerned with making money, whereas in our climate today, that's what vocation is a reference to. One of the most fascinating extended discussions of vocation that I found was in a treatise on vocations written by the English cleric William Perkins. Perkins was active in the Church of England during the latter half of the 16th century. He was among the leaders of the Puritan faction, but he chose a conformist tactic and accepted the impositions of the Elizabethan settlement. And I think a lot of his motivation, this comes out in his essay, is that he was primarily interested in cultural continuity, but that's another debate. So for Perkins, a vocation was a calling to a certain kind of life, ordained and imposed on man by God for the common good. This final phrase, common good, is important, and he included it in his very definition of vocation, which greatly helps my thesis here. Perkins would reject the view of vocation that individualizes one's calling to make it a mere matter of personal success or personal fulfillment. In fact, the very idea of vocation, stripped of the common good, is nonsensical to Perkins. In this way, Perkins notes that all men have variations of general and particular vocations. Some vocations apply in a general way to a large number of people. The most general of all vocations, of course, would be the calling of Christianity. There are less general vocations, such as fatherhood and so on. But every individual is expected, by God's revealed preferences for social order, to discover and follow some particular vocation as well. Vocation, for Perkins, was a divine appointment and encompassed both a spiritual role and a life station, such as, in his world, like a magistrate or a minister or a merchant or a laborer. So importantly, the fact that one's vocation was divinely provided meant that the vocation's legitimacy transcended the old distinction between the sacred and the secular. It was not the case for Perkins, as a good post-reformational thinker, that a calling was restrained only to the purview of church affairs. As I mentioned, his inclusion of the phrase common good is crucial. In fact, Perkins himself refers to this common good element in the definition as the final cause of every calling. Now, this is interesting. You would think for a Puritan, the final cause would be the glory of God or something, but he actually makes the final cause of every calling the common good aspect of it. So vocation for Perkins was a mechanism chosen by God to maintain, preserve, and transmit the entire social order. Because of this, Perkins stressed that the individual had an obligation not only to God, but to his fellow man, to perform his social function diligently and skillfully. Idleness for Perkins was an abandonment of God's calling, both general and particular. So to elaborate on how vocation can accomplish several of the things we've mentioned above, I'm going to summarize a few elements from Homer's epic, The Odyssey. The relationship between Odysseus, the hero, the cunning king of Ithaca, and his son Telemachus serves as a profound narrative thread that explores themes of legacy and cultural continuity. Composed around the 8th century BC, the poem chronicles Odysseus' journey home after the Trojan War. It also contains detailed depictions of Telemachus' transformation from a passive youth into a capable warrior and potential ruler, just like his father. In fact, the passivity of his youth is part of the point. How is it that this boy is imbued with the desire, the will, to partake in specific Greek virtues and to seek to embody this culture? How was he made aware of these values? How did he recognize them as values and distinguish them from vices and other inferior ways of living? At the outset of the Odyssey, Telemachus is portrayed as a young man in his late teens, overshadowed by the chaos in his own household. With Odysseus presumed dead after 20 years absent, 10 at Troy and 10 lost at sea, Telemachus' home is besieged by over 100 suitors vying for his mother Penelope's hand, thereby threatening his own inheritance and the stability of Ithaca. Telemachus is initially depicted by Homer as hesitant and ineffectual, lamenting his father's absence in the following way: "If only the gods would give me such strength as he has," he is his father, "to take revenge on the suitors for their overbearing oppression." All right, so he was portrayed in the beginning as a little bit of a whiner who had none of these Greek values that his father so perfectly portrayed. So again, this is a fascinating juxtaposition with what we know about Odysseus. He's an absolute legend, known not only for his courage, but for his decisionism, his ability to assert his will on the stage of Greek history in creative ways. Odysseus set a high bar for kingship and warrior prowess. His legend was well known, whereas his son embodies fear in the face of disorder. The epic poses the implicit chasm between Odysseus as a sort of ideal and Telemachus as needing to somehow discover and put on for himself the cultural ideals of Grecian society. The stimulus for Telemachus' education comes from divine intervention. Athena urges Telemachus to embark on a journey to seek news of his father. Athena's solution is to bring Telemachus to seek some sort of catalyst through which true cultural ideals can be learned. Traveling to Pylos and Sparta, Telemachus encounters Nestor and Menelaus, Odysseus' former comrades. From them, he learns about the importance of piety and strategic counsel. Nestor recounts Trojan battles, emphasizing how his own father's cleverness complemented Achilles' strength. They shared tales of Odysseus' endurance, including his disguise as a beggar to infiltrate Troy. These indirect lessons from his father's peers instill in Telemachus the Greek ideal of kleos, which is like glory through deeds, showing that true kingship involves not just physical might, but intellectual acuity. Through these interactions, Telemachus begins to internalize the warrior virtues. He practices xenia by hosting and being hosted, which is a ritual central to Greek society that fosters alliances and demonstrates civility amid conflict. His growing confidence is evident when he confronts the suitors upon returning to Ithaca. He declared, "I am now grown to my manhood." This maturation is a prelude to his direct learning from his own father, but it already reflects how the shadow of his father's reputation begins to shape and mold him. In Greek culture, such rites of passage were crucial. Young men underwent military training and quests to prove their worth, echoing Telemachus' journey. This narrative reinforced the cultural expectations that sons should emulate fathers to preserve and prolong a social order. So in Book 16 of the Odyssey, we find the pivotal reunion between father and son, marking the transition to hands-on mentorship. Odysseus, returned to Ithaca and disguised as a beggar, reveals himself to Telemachus in a hut. Odysseus tests him. He tests his loyalty and discretion, teaching him the art of deception, a hallmark of his own survival tactics against the Cyclops. Odysseus calls upon Telemachus to adopt a spirit of long-suffering with his statement, "Endure, my son." This reflects the Greek ideal of a stoic-like endurance that is vital for warrior kings facing adversity. Together, they plot the suitor's downfall, with Odysseus outlining a strategy that combines strength, tactical timing, and violence. Telemachus learns kingship through this collaboration. A ruler must command loyalty, assess risks, wield power judiciously to maintain justice. In the climactic battle of Book 22, Telemachus fights alongside his own father and proves to himself, to his father, and to Greek society his own warrior fortitude. He arms himself, locks the doors, and slays several suitors. The relationship between the two profoundly influenced Greek culture and the derivatives of Greek culture by idealizing the father-son bond as a conduit for cultural transmission. In a society without formal schools for elites, knowledge of warfare, governance, and ethics passed orally from fathers to sons, much like Homer's epics themselves. This dynamic between Odysseus and Telemachus in Homer's Odyssey shaped ancient Greek societal values, particularly by establishing the father-son relationship as a critical mechanism for passing down essential cultural, moral, and practical knowledge. The dynamic between Odysseus as warrior, as the vocation bearer, and Telemachus as his student and son comes alive in the transformation of the son into the image of his father. The duty of the father here is to transmit the heroic qualities that he bears onto his son. The duty of the son is to receive and absorb the qualities being transmitted. The core values that were prized in ancient Greek culture were facilitated in the carrying out of vocational duty. For Telemachus, these included things like personal heroism, hospitality, and the protection and promotion of his inherited wisdom. The father-son dynamic not only illustrates how Telemachus learns the arts of warfare and kingship directly and indirectly from his father, but also encapsulates core values of ancient Greek culture such as heroism, hospitality, and the transmission of wisdom. So, at this point, we've said a lot about vocation, and we've provided a sweeping narrative to make some interesting points. But what does it all mean in the here and now, and how does it relate to this conference on generational wealth? Let's take that second part first. What is wealth? When most people think of wealth, indeed when we all think of wealth in a colloquial sense, we think of the abundance of valuable material resources or assets that provide financial security or material comfort. We usually measure our wealth in terms like money and property, investments, and so on. Wealth to us is a great complex of material goods, or the access to material goods. Here, vocation in the traditional sense doesn't have a necessary connection to wealth, though of course a career very much does have this connection. In order to make the traditional understanding of vocation intelligible, we need to have a better understanding of wealth. I think that many came to this conference for content related to material wealth. And don't misunderstand me, there's nothing wrong with material wealth. Material wealth is, in fact, a reward given to a people who are faithful in the transmission of their culture. Material wealth is a means of building the kingdom of God and Christianizing the nations. So I'm not here to avoid talk of material wealth, but what I want to stress is that our complex of culture, our family structures, our moral imagination as a people, our habitual practicing of the traditional values, our commitment to our own Christian European heritage, these constitute the true wealth of nations. Financial wealth without cultural wealth is a recipe for consumptionism unto death. Is there any other further proof of this needed than the world that exists around us? Plato famously urged that we ought not to focus on passing on to our children an abundance of riches, but a spirit of reverence. The point here is that great thinkers like Louis de Bonald in revolutionary France were entirely correct to focus their understanding of wealth in the people and their traditions, their moral fortitude, and their institutions. Money is fleeting. Material wealth comes and goes, but culture sustains a people over time. A healthy culture will find itself eventually in material abundance. A sick culture will find its stock of material abundance in a state of constant depletion. Bonald stated this in his reaction to Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations. He noted that Smith wasn't actually talking about the true wealth of nations at all. He was merely talking about the material wealth of individuals collectively calculated. But the true wealth of nations, the true wealth of us as a people, consists not of bank account balances, but of our morals and our laws. It was the morals and laws, says Bonald, that are the only true and only wealth of nations. At this generational wealth conference, we should let it be known that there is no generational wealth possible without that spirit of reverence, without a cultural deeply rooted in virtue, in family, in norms that encourage the very things that have made it successful and lasting in the first place. My point with all of that is this. Vocation is only a catalyst of culture if we can first make true vocation the foundation for things like jobs and careers. And if we can make cultural wealth the foundation for things like material wealth. So let's step away from the theoretical and address the real world. All that I've said about vocation so far supports the view that vocation is much broader than just a career path or a job. In fact, there's a little bit of a debate among social theologians, and I spent many hours in this debate, about whether a job should even be seen as a vocation at all. Sometimes, by happenstance, there is an overlap, of course, but for most people, especially in the 21st century, it may not be helpful to consider a job as one's ultimate vocation. Vocation implies meaning. It implies something related to the common good. It implies, as we have seen, a function of cultural catalyst. Jobs, however, with a few exceptions, are increasingly seen as meaningless, even soulless. As we venture deeper into the periphery of the modern managerialistic economic system, the chasm between jobs and vocation actually is expanding. That's one of the troubling characteristics of our socio-political moment. Would that our pastors and our churchmen and our Christian leaders understand the challenge confronting young men, especially in their ability to discover opportunities for true vocation. Can today's jobs be catalysts of culture at all? It is easy to answer this in the affirmative in an age when jobs are synonymous with vocation. We can imagine the swinging arm of the blacksmith, the careful craftsmanship of the carpenter, the tireless determination of the yeoman farmer. These types of vocations are means of economic survival. The sons of these laborers, or perhaps their apprentices, will absorb decades of experience and cultural development. These vocations, as catalysts of culture, are so easy to identify. The patterns of habits embodied in these types of vocations blossomed over many ages and generations and centuries of men in the West. There was a certain connection that a farmer had in one generation with a farmer 400 years prior. And you don't have to look back at the pre-industrial age to grasp this concept. My own grandfather was an electrician. My dad still has one of his hard hats. My grandfather helped to construct a major tower in the Sacramento region. As a child, we would drive by it from time to time, and my dad would point it out and say, "Papa helped to build that." There on the hill were heavy-duty wires touched and carried into place by my own flesh and blood. Long before I was born, before I was even a thought in his mind, he worked away in the hot Sacramento sun, laboring in sweat, working to provide a paycheck for my grandmother that she might clothe my own father. This is vocation as a catalyst of culture. The very fact of his expending effort, of dedicating himself to his profession, determined to provide for his family and employ the skills that he had, was itself something that would disseminate into the mind and soul of my own father. This phenomenon, of course, is not just relegated to father and son, though in this talk I've stressed this as the purest form of cultural continuity. But even as we reflect on any number of professions, vocations, and occupations, we absorb so much in the way of culture. Consider how any heritage American who grew up with roots in American culture sees the Chicago-style fireman, or the Texas-style rancher, or the Minnesota-style lumberjack, or the Maine-style fisherman. These are archetypes. They're built into the way we see the world. They structure our fondness for our own story as a people. We don't very often reflect on the economic benefits, but we can very much see in them a means of cultural continuity. It is true that we live in an age of cultural sickness. One might even say that a distinguishing element of our moment, perhaps implied since the beginning of the 20th century, is that the job and the vocation have become enemies of each other. Picture for a moment the late 20th century image of some New York City corporate career. The ideal was that you could start at the very, very bottom rung of the corporate ladder and at entry-level minimum wage. Over time and hard work, dedicating your life to the company and forsaking all others until death do you part, you might one day be a member of the executive board. While such a vision undermines the traditional framework of vocation as oriented toward the common good and is saturated with individualism and materialism, at least it provides some sort of stability in the overall meaning of the individual's life. Our present economic situation, however, does not allow anything close to even this. Careerism is itself out of reach for so many would-be middle-class men. We operate in the so-called gig economy. We're like TaskRabbits. So many are forced to have multiple streams of paltry income, dozens of jobs in several industries over time. It seems to me that this age of random jobs to survive means that vocation and means of making a living are even more separated than they were in earlier times. What this means is that while vocation in a broad sense is still a necessity, finding vocational fulfillment isn't always possible in one's employment. There's an interesting parallel between this crisis of meaningful vocation and Philip Rief's concept of what he calls the anti-culture. Rief delineates human history into three cultural worlds, three relationships between the divine and the society. He calls them the first world, the second world, and the third world. The first world is mythic, fate-bound society. There is no personal God here. This would be the old pagan civilization of the ancient world. The second world is that of the revealed religions with a personal God like Christianity. In both the first and the second worlds, the culture contained in them enforces a sacred order of divine prohibitions and communal duties. All of the cultural elements we talked about above are reflections of sort of heaven on earth. But we no longer live in either of these cultural frameworks, according to Rief. We now live in a completely new context here in the 20th, when he was writing, and especially now in the 21st century. We live in Rief's third world, which he terms an anti-culture. It is the inversion of culture. What we call culture is a stand-in for culture, as I said above. According to Rief, we have undergone a paradigm shift where traditional moral and religious structures, once anchors for meaning and restraint, are dismantled in favor of psychological self-management and instinctual release. Rief argues that our emphasis above, that culture is saturated with a need to be outwardly focused on the common good, directing ourselves toward shared purposes, sustained by a transcendent authority that curbs human desires for the sake of communal flourishing. But anti-culture inverts this. It forbids all forbidding, scorning repression as pathology, and elevating personal well-being as the ultimate telos, resulting in a society adrift, severed from its past, and especially incapable of transmitting values to the future. At the heart of this shift is Rief's concept of what he calls the triumph of the therapeutic. The therapeutic age has replaced the age of religion and the age of economics. This framework is derived, the therapeutic framework is derived from Sigmund Freud's concept of psychological man, which Reif draws upon but radicalizes. So no longer the economic man of industrial capitalism who balanced self-interest with social contribution, nor the political man of civic duty, but an autonomous egoist seeking insight, practical, experimental, and leading to the mastery of his own personality. That's quotes from Reif. So this therapeutic ethos promises liberation from the collar of cultural demands, yet all it delivers is fragmentation and chaos. Without a sacred order, divine or communal, to predicate human action, cultures devolve into mere residues of culture unstable and self-undermining. The third world's repudiation of true culture leads to constant revolutionizing of beliefs and behavior, where elites no longer produce true cultural artifacts, the Old Testaments to the glories of divine order. Instead, they produce what Reif calls death works, like subversive art or policy that erode foundational norms. Instead of ballet, we get The Simpsons. Instead of orchestras, we get death metal and ghetto rap. The result of a post-ascetic culture of remissive freedoms where instincts reign unchecked, fostering isolation and anxiety. And ultimately, even for Reif, our means of making a living are severed from the meaningfulness of true vocation. This anti-cultural dynamic transforms work from a vocation embedded in sacred and communal purpose into a hollow arena of therapeutic self-striving. In second world cultures, which is where Christendom fits in, labor was interwoven with the sacred order. The medieval artisan's craft glorified God, the Protestant work ethic framed toil as divine calling, and even secular guilds transmitted intergenerational wisdom, binding individuals to a larger narrative of creation and stewardship. Work here was not just economic, but soteriological, a ritual of obedience that combated narcissism and emptiness through disciplined outlets for cultural development. This, in effect, returned the individual, improved and chastised, back to society, much like Telemachus. Tragically, in Reif's third world, the anti-culture severs these ties, rendering jobs instrumental to the self's inward journey rather than outward contribution. Contemporary work then becomes a site of impoverishment, where purpose is not derived from transcendent accountability, but from personal fulfillment. Consider then the gig economy or corporate cubicle life, which is so emblematic of the 21st century labor. Platforms like Uber and Upwork promise flexibility and self-expression, yet all they do is atomize workers into isolated contractors, stripped of communal rituals or long-term narratives. This is like, what Chris just talked about a few minutes ago, but all of it's been exaggerated. We're even more siloed, we're even more separated, we're even, the family itself has been taken out of the home, but the individual now has been taken out of the family. Reif anticipates all of the present crisis in his critique of therapeutic alliance with consumerism. Work accommodates the modal self to economic imperatives, reinterpreting drudgery through lenses of addiction and victimhood, but ultimately eroding individual responsibility. In our era of AI automation and remote silos, jobs feel meaningless because they no longer direct the self outward toward cultural renewal. They internalize the anti-cultural's own hedonism, where success is measured in psychological metrics like work-life balance rather than communal living. Reif's insight reveals why this meaninglessness compounds cultural instability. As work loses its role in value transmission, generations inherit not disciplined purpose, but a hermeneutic of suspicion toward all authority and all culture. Couple more minutes. In the midst of all this, there is a need to rediscover the outward orientedness of a true vocation. Part of what needs to be done corporately is that we must rediscover the relation of sacred order to our social order. This requires us to start the process of recovery in our daily lives. If vocation seems to have devolved into a rote and incoherent task list, we ought still to transform these tasks into a sacred arena for displaying and exemplifying noble virtues, drawn especially and chiefly from Christian tradition. By intentionally embodying virtues, we can sanctify our meaningless jobs, fostering spiritual growth and moral witness and quiet kingdom building. We can, like a whisper, transmit culture in a world of anti-culture. In doing this, we are able to reaffirm that true nobility stems not from occupational prestige, but from faithfulness to God's design for human labor. Patristics like St. Basil the Great in his homilies emphasized labor as imitation of the Creator's orderly work, and he urged all believers to toil with excellence, regardless of circumstance. Such a mentality to the drudges of 21st century fake work can reinstill a vocational element to even the most trivial job. In a job deemed meaningless, perhaps folding laundry in a hotel or monitoring factory gauges, one might succumb to apathy. However, virtues like perseverance or diligence can redeem it. We really must take to heart Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to man. In fact, consider this list of 7 traditional virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and then the last 3 are the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. There is not one of them that cannot be practiced in our daily jobs and tasks. These are the mechanisms of retransforming jobs back into vocations. Collectively, these virtues, infused into mundane work, contribute to the church's mission. They echo the medieval Corpus Christi metaphor, where every member serves the body, one of the ultimate vocations. You all are vessels of cultural transmission. In an age that expects us to partake in the anti-culture, we must all find ways to keep alive the residues of our cultural patrimony that we have been given. It's what our fathers did. It's what our children must do. It is part of our duty to God and nation. But we must ground our efforts of cultural transformation in the self-sacrificial application of Christian virtue. There is no generational wealth outside the cultural wealth of a civilization drenched in the Christian vision of social order. Thank you.